Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party supports the second reading of the Border Processing Trade Single Windows and Duties Bill. In fact, as the Minister might have noted, but I don't think he did, it had its origins as a system under the last Labor government. That's where the concepts and the issues were worked through. And of course the Labor Party would support it if it facilitates the movement of goods across the border, either imports or exports, and does not diminish the necessity for border protection, in particular, as we're a trading and agricultural country, the biosecurity provisions. So what this bill does is reasonably straightforward. It amends the Customs and Excise Act of 1996 and also the Biodiversity Act of 1993. And why we need it is because it is required in order to implement the trade single window component of the joint border management system. Now, in that one sentence alone, anybody listening to this debate would say, what the hell are they talking about? So perhaps we should explain what that jargon means. Although the Minister for Customs indicating that perhaps it's the government policy to always keep the public in ignorance as a preference. It's not the policy of the Labor Party to do that, however. What it means, the joint border management system is basically indicating that it's a joint initiative between Customs and the Ministry of Primary Industry, and it replaces the current system of providing information about movement across the border, and it modernises and integrates border clearance processes, both for people and for goods, on aircraft and ships that are arriving and departing from New Zealand. The first stage of this tranche 1 has actually been implemented already last year. And I just want to ask the Minister a question about that and hope that he'll come back in the committee stages or subsequent national speakers will raise the answers or give the answers to these questions. It is a computer system. It's IT based. And we've had a lot of experience of implementing new computer systems in New Zealand. The Minister introducing the bill will remember INSIS. Interestingly, he doesn't. He's got a very selective memory, this Minister. INSIS was a total botch, Mr. Speaker, introduced under a national government to try to upgrade the police information technology system. And interestingly, INSIS involved the same international or multinational computer company, IBM, that is involved in this system. Now, I've heard, Minister, that there have been some problems with the information technology. The government has been very quiet about it, possibly following the philosophy that the Minister has acknowledged on 2 occasions, lack of transparency and not talking about things that might be uncomfortable. But I've heard that there are some difficulties, and I would like to know from the Minister or from subsequent speakers in the national government what those difficulties have been in the technology system. How big have those problems been? How are we seeking to address those problems? Have those problems been resolved? And what is the additional cost that might have been incurred? It is really important that we know that. In fact, you know, when this bill was introduced, it was introduced not by the Minister, Maurice Williamson, but by Craig Foss. And Craig Foss was, of course, the Minister in charge of NovoPay. Well, NovoPay is still causing 18 months out huge problems in my electorate, to the schools in my electorate. And when I saw Craig Foss in the chair introducing this legislation, I thought, my God, it might have been Labor's concept, but do I really trust the implementation of this system on Craig Foss and the national government? And the answer to that question patently is no. Why would you? We've had experience of those costly failures, and I just think it is incumbent on the next national speaker to address the question of what difficulties have so far been incurred in implementing Tranche 1, which is covered by this legislation. Because if there are major problems, this House and New Zealanders need to know about that. We have the right to know, and the government has the obligation to be upfront, open and transparent about it. As I say those words, I feel a sense of naivety in expecting those things from a national government, but I am asking for it. We're not dividing the House on this bill. We're in support of the concepts. We want to know that the Minister has implemented this properly and that the system is working. Now, I did say before, Mr Speaker, that I'd explain the other part of the jargon, trade single windows. It's a curious phrase, trade single windows, but what it essentially means is that there will be a single portal through which business and industry can meet customs and Ministry of Primary Industry arrival and departure requirements. There are three changes needed that this legislation has to deal with in order for this new system to be introduced. One is to register the users of the Joint Border Management System. The second is to provide information for the trade single window system. And the third is simply the consequential changes to offences that are created. With registration, it's the most important part of this bill. It's about providing for all individuals and companies that interact with the Joint Border Management System to be registered with Customs. It sets out the grounds on which registration might be refused by the Minister. It prescribes the form and the manner of the registration, and it allows for the Chief Executives to issue joint unique user identifiers to access approved border information. So those things are necessary. I've got to say, from a trade perspective, speaking as Labor's spokesperson on trade, this is a model that is compatible with the World Customs Organisation. It means that we are using internationally comparable and compatible data, and it includes customs, biosecurity and food-related information, and that is an advantage of what the bill does. The information that has to be provided for trade single windows by the users is advance notice on the arrival and the departure of the craft that are carrying the goods and the people, and it says who must provide cargo reports. Mr Speaker, I want to come back to the fundamentals of this legislation and why Labor is supporting it. We're supporting it because, as a trading nation, we have to do everything we can to minimise the costs to those who are exporting from New Zealand. We have to be internationally competitive, and having a border system that is efficient and effective is fundamental to that. From the viewpoint of importing, it's about trying to minimise the costs that might be imposed on the consumer in New Zealand. So that's a fairly straightforward argument. The second criteria that we would, the criterion that we would look at on this is, because we're an agricultural exporting country, nearly two-thirds of our exports are primary sector based, we need to have proper biosecurity protection. And I don't think this bill does damage to that, but I want to see this bill in the context of what has already been done by the government over recent times. And I've got to say I've got concerns about what's been done, because in the budget for 2013-14, there's $6 million cut out of biosecurity. Now, I worry about that. Yes, I know a government wants to make savings, but the savings can be tiny in comparison to the costs if something goes wrong. And what better evidence of that do we need than the importation of the PSA disease affecting horticulture into New Zealand that is costing hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm really worried that this government, in cutting back biosecurity, is going to incur huge costs for New Zealand, Mr Speaker. I remember back in 2009 they also made cuts to biosecurity. 54 biosecurity officers were cut at that point. And then you'd have to raise the question in terms of the, we've been talking about importing biosecurity hazards, but what about exporting? Today we almost had a debate on the fact that deregulating the meat inspector regime, which, Mr Speaker, you and I are very familiar with. I worked for 7 years in the freezing works as a slaughterman. You equally were closely involved in that. And when you deregulate and you say the company becomes the manager of these standards, you put those standards at risk, because the company has a conflict of interest. And we've seen on 7 occasions, Mr Speaker, on 7 occasions we did not meet the zero tolerance requirements for the United States market for meat. That's worth $6 billion or more. And I'm really worried about the cost-cutting mentality of this government that would put our exports at risk. We saw the disaster that was incurred in terms of the Chinese market, with the botulism scare, with the DCD scare, and other problems because the government was penny pinching. So what I don't want to see in this legislation is for the government to be penny pinching. I want to see proper biosecurity, and I also want to be sure that this IT system is working as intended. I want the next Speaker from the government to give that assurance to the House that that IT system is working as intended and there are not significant difficulties with it. With that, Mr Speaker, we support the bill, but obviously conditional on the government giving that assurance.
I call the honourable member John